Hey everyone, in this video I'm actually going to build on a video I did a few weeks ago which was about using PowerShell with Azure, kind of getting started. And one of the pieces of feedback I got back was, hey, could you spend a bit more time on the unattended authentication scenarios? Maybe I'm running something in Azure or maybe something on-prem as part of some automation that wants to connect to Azure. So all I'm going to do in this video is to dive a little bit more detail about things like managed identities, but also then using service principals from on-prem using secret or certificate-based authentication. As always, if this is useful, a like, subscribe, comment, and share is appreciated. So what we're really thinking about here is we have Azure Active Directory as always. And that's really that source of all the identities we're using when we interact with Azure. And we'll start with thinking about, well, I have some resource actually running in Azure. This could be a VM, this could be a function, there's many different types of object. But they want to run some PowerShell, and I want to stress, I'm talking about PowerShell, but all of these concepts would apply equally if I was using the CLI. You would just substitute the commands, but all the same principles about managed identity and service principles would apply the same way. So what I want to do is I'm running here in Azure, and what I want to do is maybe interact with some other Azure resource. So maybe it's a storage account, a SQL database, Cosmos DB, something else. And so obviously I have to authenticate first. Now one of the challenges we always face is, well, how do I handle storing a secret or certificate? So the best thing we can do is not to have it. And that's where managed identity comes in. And there's two types. So the first one we're going to look at is a system assigned managed identity. And that's just something I can turn on for a resource, and then it natively has this kind of system assigned managed identity. Now that is a resource in Azure AD. And its life cycle is tied directly to the resource. If the resource goes away, so too does that managed identity. And behind the scenes, it's really just a service principal. It's just managed automatically for us. Now, the key point of this managed identity is only this particular resource I enable it for can act as that managed identity. And it doesn't have to know a secret or a certificate or anything. It can call out to a special endpoint and say, hey, I need a token for my system assigned managed identity. And what I would now do is that system assigned managed identity, I would use RBAC to give it various permissions on resources in Azure. I could even give it Azure AD roles as well. So let's start with that. So if I jump over to the portal, and I've just got a very basic virtual machine here, and what we can see straight away is I can just go to identity over here, and we can see I have turned on the system assigned managed identity. So it now has a managed identity it can leverage. Exactly the same way I could do this for other things, something like a function, for example. It also has the option of an identity that I can just turn on. And then I would give that managed identity RBAC. For example, I could just go to something like a storage account. I could go to my access control. I could add a role assignment. And notice here it's saying assign access to users, groups, or service principals. But I can also do a system assigned managed identity for all these different things. Notice here we have a function app, but I can also do a virtual machine. And there's my VM. Notice I could do exactly the same way for something like a function. All those ones I've enabled that managed identity for. Likewise in Azure AD, fundamentally there's all these different roles. I could select a role. I could then go and add an assignment. And when I select my members, I can just start typing. So that was my demo VM. Well, there's the identity for that. If it was a service principal exactly the same way, well, hey, there's a service principal I have. So I can give it RBAC for various different things. Now, in this particular case, if I was to just jump back up, and if I just go to my subscription and look at my subscription, and I look at my access control and all my role assignments, I can see down here, hey, that demo VM has reader. So what I'm going to do now is jump over to that virtual machine. So this is that VM. Now to use that managed identity, I can literally just say, hey, connect AZ account -identity. I don't have to know anything else. So it's now connected as that identity. I can look at my AZ context and I can see it showing me, hey, yeah, look, you're actually using that MSI account over there. Let's close that down. Now, remember, I could give that access to different things. So in this case, I'm going to try and access just very simply a blob. I'm going to try and get a blob. So I'm going to execute that. Remember, that's running as that managed identity, and it fails. It does not have permission. Okay. Now note, the other things I can do in here is I can actually look at, well, what is the service principal for this particular VM? What is the service principal, for example, for a function? Notice that fails. I don't have permission because that's a different resource. But that's okay. We'll come back to that. So that's me just using that system assigned managed identity, and I can do whatever that managed identity has permission to. So that's great. There's also something called a user assigned managed identity. So a user assigned managed identity, this is a separate object. I create this. So it has its own life cycle. And once again, I can do RBAC to different things. And what I'm then going to do is I'm going to add the ability for various resources to be allowed to use that particular user assigned managed identity. So the benefit here is that same managed identity could be given to multiple resources that they could all use. If I had maybe a farm of 20 servers that all required the same access to various Azure resources, well, I don't want to have to assign that 20 times to 20 different system assigned managed identities, which remember, have a one-to-one correlation with a resource. I could give them all the right to use a particular user assigned managed identity that I have created. And once again, I would give that various roles. So if we jump back over here, what we can now see, if I actually go over, and if we look at managed identities, I've actually created a managed identity. And then what I can do is on the resources, under identity, under user assigned, I can add additional identities it is allowed to actually request and act on behalf of. Now in this case, for this particular managed identity, remember that storage I tried to get and it failed? Well, if I go to that actual storage account and I actually go and look at the access control and role assignments, I've actually given that particular managed identity, actually I think I did it at the container level, so let's go and look at containers and images. If I look at my access control here, we'll actually notice I have this storage blob data reader. So I gave that user assigned managed identity an additional permission. Remember, this blob data reader is a data plane role. So it can actually go and interact, in this case, read blobs. So if I go back over to that VM, what I'm now actually going to do is, well, I'm actually going to, for this case, get the VM. And then I can actually go and look at things like, well, that would be that, again, that system assigned managed identity. But if I have this AZ managed service identity module, I'm actually going to get a particular user assigned managed identity. And now what I can actually do is I can use that connect AZ account -identity and now tell it which identity I want to use. So this time I'm actually going to connect as that user assigned managed identity. As you can see in the line above, I kind of got a reference to that MI Saviltech1. So now I'm actually going to connect as that identity instead. Once again, I can look at my AZ context, and now we see we're actually authenticated with a different principal. The account has changed. And now, well, because I'm a different account, let's try and actually get that blob again. Remember, that user assigned actually had permissions on the data plane. And that time it worked. It actually went through and it got the actual image. So now if I actually jump over to Explorer and I go to my pictures, sure enough, there's a picture that it got over there of my dogs eating cereal that they stole as I put it on the couch. So that's given me that idea that, hey, these managed identities are super, super powerful and really things that I think about, I'm going to use those. So if I am a resource in Azure, user managed identity, either the system assigned or I can use user assigned if there's multiple compute resources that need access to the same things. I don't want to have to reassign those multiple times. So that's fantastic if I'm in Azure. What about if I'm not in Azure? What about if I'm on-prem? What about if I'm in a different cloud? So that's where we actually get into service principals. Think an account. A service principal is really an account. And what happens is it gets tied to an application object in Azure AD. I do kind of an app registration that creates a service principal that I can then use. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about that relationship. If you're curious, I did a deep dive video about service principals and app registrations and enterprise apps, the kind of link up there. That will give you all that detail. But fundamentally, what we're going to do is we're going to create a service principal. And that's going to manifest itself as kind of an enterprise app that is linked to by an app registration. Now, we are not going to use the app registration. It's just there. When I create a service principal, it's going to create an app registration. But then once again, that service principal I can create, hey, guess what? I can do RBAC on certain things. I can give it permissions, whatever I need. I can give it Azure AD roles. Now, the issue here, obviously, is I have some resource running here that wants to use that service principal. It wants to authenticate. So this lets me do that unattended. Well, obviously, I have to be able to prove I have the rights to do that. I can't use the managed identity. So what we're actually going to have to do is essentially this is going to have either a secret, basically a password, or I'm going to use certificate. And obviously keep the private key here, and that would know about the thumbprint. So obviously at this point, I have to be able to store these. Never put them in code. Never check them into your repository. If it's a secret, maybe I have a Vault technology on-prem that I could store it in. There is like a secrets management PowerShell module that hooks into the credential manager Credman. Maybe I can leverage that. But just make sure it's not in the code, it's not in a config file that's going to kind of get populated into some repo somewhere. If it's a certificate, again, I still maybe want to put that in the Vault. Certificate's preferred over a secret. Maybe I can lock down that private key, make sure it's not exportable, and there's various things you're going to do to check. But it means now I have to use one of these things. And again, a cert is preferable here. Just generally, it's considered more secure than a secret. So what I'm going to do now is just walk through creating these so you can actually see what they look like in action. But again, if I'm in Azure, user managed identity, it's better. If I'm not, another cloud, if I'm on-prem, then sure, create a service principal, and I'm going to use a certificate and or cert. I can have both on the same thing. So let's take a look at this. So what I'm going to start off with is actually just leveraging a very basic service principal with almost passing it nothing. Now, you have a whole bunch of these service principals already. Many different things would have created them. Again, they're a representation of an application used in your Azure AD. So I have a huge number of these. But what I'm going to do first is actually just create one that uses a password. So that's the default. And you can see here, I'm going to say, hey, I want to create a new Azure AZ AD service principal, the display name, and that's it. Now, by default, this will give it contributor over my current subscription. So I'm just going to run that. And that has now created a new service principal. And notice it's given it contributor over the scope of the subscription. Now at this point, I could jump over to Azure AD. I'd be able to see in my app registrations, if I go to all apps, and I just search for SAV SP. There we go. There is that one I just created. And if I look at it, it will actually show me here that kind of managed application in the local identity. So I can actually go and click that. And then there's the actual enterprise app that is that service principal. So that's what it actually went and created. So it created an app registration and it created an enterprise app to kind of represent it. And at this point, I could just give it permissions to things. Now, as you saw, it automatically gave it contributor. But once again, I could really give it access to anything I wanted. If we just go and look at access control and we look at role assignments, I could add a new role assignment. Notice it even shows me assign access to service principal in addition to users and groups. Now you may say, well, I can't see it. Well, it doesn't really list them, but if you just start typing, so SAV SP, well, there it is. And I can now give it that role. So at this point, it created it with kind of an automatic password. Now I can look at that. So here I'm just gonna, remember I saved that out to an object, so it auto-generated the password. And if I wanted to, I can come and look at that. And now you need to store this somewhere, remember? So that is that kind of unsecure secret. You'd store that, a vault, a credential, or something. And again, if we looked at the app registration for this, you'll see that it's configured to use a secret. So if we actually go and look at it, and my certificates and secrets, hey look, it has a client secret. So that was fairly easy. So we just created that. Now again, I have that pain at this point that I have to be able to store that secret somewhere. You have some kind of vault on premises, something. Maybe now I want to create one with a custom password. I want to set it. So next time I'm going to create a AD password credential object, and essentially I'm setting what I want the password to be, and I'm setting an expiry time. So I'm basically doing get date for the year 2023. So I'm going to run that to create the credential object, and then I'm just going to create a new AZ AD service principal using that custom credential. Now what you'll notice this time is it doesn't give it a default role. There was no assigning role contributor over a scope. And what I have here is if you were really desperate, this is kind of how you could essentially store a password to a file and then read it back and get it back to a secure string. I do not recommend that at all. I'm not going to show it. I put the code in the file just to show an example of how it could be done. But again, use a vault. Do not put it in a file. So at this point, if we looked at those objects, well, here I can see, well, great, that automatically generated one has contributor. My custom one has nothing. So you would now go in and give it different roles. In this case, I could give it something like reader. So I could actually go and add reader to that role. And there can sometimes be a little bit of a delay. Let's see if this actually shows it for me. Over here. No, it's not showing it, but it is there. If I actually go back and look at my subscription and I look at all my roles, we'll see those service principals. So one of them, there's that default, has contributor. And then the one I just gave, there we go, has reader. So they now have these roles so they can do various things. So at this point, I would authenticate as that. So to authenticate, I'm going to have to kind of pass the Azure AD tenant. So this particular Azure AD instance has kind of a tenant ID. I'm going to pass the service principal ID and then the secret. So we're actually going to do the authentication. That will give us the token back that represents that service principal. And then any rights that service principal was given, I now have because I've authenticated as that service principal. So let's actually go and see that. So here, I will actually now authenticate as them. So I need my Azure AD tenant. So I'm just going to quickly get that from my current Azure AD context. Don't know what I just did then. I jumped to the bottom of the screen. I pushed the wrong key. So I will push F8 to execute, get the tenant. So I'm going to authenticate with the secret. So again, I'm going to create a credential using the application ID and that kind of password. So I'm creating a credential. Now I'm connecting as that credential. If I look at my context, I can see I'm account 026FE3E4, which is that. It is that credential I created. I can do various things. I can look at resource groups based on the roles I was given. Now I'll authenticate with that custom secret. Again, it's exactly the same thing. I'm just converting to secure string that password I had. Do exactly the same connection. Check my context. Notice it's a different account now that matches, yep, my application ID. So we can really see, yep, I'm authenticating as that particular service principal. And so that's really how I can use the secrets. Again, it's not difficult to create these things. What's difficult is how are you going to securely store that secret? And again, that's where you look at vaults, maybe the secrets management module in PowerShell, which hooks into Credential Manager. And again, I keep seeing this is PowerShell, but AZ CLI has exactly the same capabilities for the managed identities for the service principals. Now, the other option is I'm going to use a certificate. And that's generally better. I'm going to create a public-private key pair. I'm going to keep that private key super secure, and I'll then authenticate with that. Now, in my case, I'm going to use a self-signed certificate. This could also be if you have an enterprise certificate authority, you could go and get a certificate from that and use that to register and create a service principal. So this time, let's jump back over again. And so if I keep scrolling down over here, so now we're going to use certificates. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually create a self-signed certificate called self-signed cert. And I'm going to stick it in my sort of personal space under the current user. So I'm just going to create a new cert. So that's done. Now, we can actually use MMC, for example. And just jump back over again. There we go. And if I added certificates, and for my user account, we'll see there's that self-signed cert. And I have the private key. So you have a private key that corresponds to the certificate. Okay, fantastic, what I wanted. So now I'm just going to get the kind of a key value. I can look at all those certificates. Again, there's my self-signed cert. And what I'm now going to do is create a new Azure AD service principal, this time using a certificate, and it's going to have a start date and an end date equal to that of the certificate. So I'm going to go and create a new cert. Now, once again, if we look at this, it doesn't have any default roles. So I'd have to give it a role. For example, I'm just giving it reader. Once again, I can go and get the thumbprint of my certificate if I need it, because now I want to actually authenticate as it. So to authenticate as it, I have to have the private key available to me. Obviously, I have it on this machine because I generated that cert. So I'm going to say connect using a particular certificate thumbprint. Once again, I'm telling it the tenant ID, the app ID, and once again, I'm telling it, hey, it's a service principal. So now I've actually connected as that. So once again, I've got the account and it matches that of, you can see that's 7979. So I have at this point authenticated with that actual service principal by just having that private certificate on my box. So you have to make sure you protect that certificate. Again, make sure it's available to me. But that's kind of an alternate way that I can, in a completely unattended fashion. Again, I'm typing the commands, but they would absolutely typically be part of some script. And so you'd have that certificate on the box that it would be able to actually leverage. Now, I showed it with a self-signed. The documentation, I've got a link in the file, actually has an example of actually doing it with something from an actual certificate authority. You can kind of see that over there. But that's really what there is to it. Now, the other thing, let's jump back to my context, is realize these have a finite life cycle. Do I want this to just last forever? Probably not. So when I'm using these, I have to think about kind of rotating. Managed instance, that's done for me. I don't have to think about that. If I'm doing a certificate, maybe it lasts for a year or 2 years. So I have to rotate, create a new cert. Secret, maybe I'm going to create a new secret every year or 2 years. So just remember, you build that into your process. So from a scripting perspective, over here, and just to kind of prove a point, I can just create a new app credential. So here's another password, and I'm actually going to add it to my certificate one. So if we go back and look at all of my app registrations, and we do my SAV SP, I now have 3. So I've got my password, my custom password, and my certificate. So my certificate is using a certificate for the way I can actually authenticate. Notice here, I could upload certs. I could add a new secret. I could actually create the registration directly in the portal. But what I'm going to do now is, hey, I've created this new secure string. I'm going to create a new app credential for that application ID, and I'm going to make it last for 1 year. So if I just run this, I've added it, and if I go back, let's jump around, let's refresh. There we go. So now I have this client secret as well. So I can have certificates and secrets. Again, you just want to make sure I'm really rotating those things. And to kind of prove a point, if I delete the service principals, what we'll actually see is the enterprise apps all get deleted. So I'm going to remove all of those things I just created because I'm not leaving those hanging around. So I'm going to delete all 3 of them. So if we go back now to Azure AD, if I go to my app registration, go to my all apps, they're all still there. But if I select one, there now is no associated service principal. If I was to actually go to my enterprise apps, again, they've gone. So if I go to my all apps and just start searching, they've gone. They're not there anymore. That kind of shows the relationship between them. So the service principal is the enterprise app. But I still have my app registrations. Well, to fully clean up, now I can remove the app registration as well, just to make sure we're kind of cleaning up after ourselves. This is just a demo. And what we'll now see is, let's do a refresh. My apps, they've all gone as well. And then finally, hey, I have that certificate, that self-signed that I was using. We can see it there. Well, I'm going to pipe that to remove item and delete it. So now, abracadabra, it's gone. And I just have the little AZ AD command if you are using the Azure CLI, if you're interested in that. But that's really the key point. Again, nothing amazingly complex about the creation of the service principal, but you really have to think about, how am I storing the secret, that certificate, in a secure manner that doesn't pose a risk? Never check it into a source control. Ideally, again, you have some kind of vault technology. If this was a CI/CD pipeline, they may have their own native vaults that you can leverage. Make sure I do think about rotating it periodically. Clean up after yourself. But that's how I can, from an unattended perspective, use those things. Managed instance is my preference. Service principal with cert, then service principal with secret. The code for this is in the description. It's on my random stuff GitHub repo if you're interested. But until next time, take care.